Read the second time. The honourable member for Nelson.
That's cleaned.
Is it?
Cleaned that.
Excellent. Excellent. Mr President, today I've listened to the Honourable Leader put the government's case for this bill, and I've listened to the contributions of other members, and I certainly appreciate very much hearing their thoughts on it. I've also met with stakeholders and have attended departmental briefings on this bill and briefings provided by other stakeholder groups. And I thank all those stakeholder groups and the departmental officials for their really generous time and generous approach to continuing to provide materials for us to add to our understanding of this bill and to respond to things that we were being presented with in other circumstances. Mr President, I've also received quite a high number of communications from constituents on this bill and from Tasmanians, indeed, outside my electorate. I must say that none of those communications that I've directly received from the Tasmanian public have been in support of this bill. All of them have expressed concern, anger at times and anxiety. And I think that that's probably no surprise then that we find this is a complex bill before us and to some extent a controversial one, given what we can observe in the Tasmanian community in terms of quite extensive response. Mr President, I am not a planning expert. I don't intend to pretend I'm a planning expert, but that is not the sole and exclusive consideration that we are to bring to bear here when considering this bill. It's our role in this place to evaluate proposed legislation against a whole range of criteria to undertake our function of review. We are certainly to consider fundamental democratic principles such as good governance, transparency and accountability, consistency, fairness and due process. Therefore, while it's incumbent upon me to listen to those with planning expertise, it's equally important to listen to those potentially affected. Mr President, in relation to this bill, I've heard it identified that a planning process which allows for projects of a certain scale and complexity to be dealt with under an independent, non-political assessment with concurrent consideration by regulators and an early indication of a reasonable prospect of success would provide proponents with a process that is shorter, simpler and involves less financial risk. It would give them more confidence. And I accept that such a process is one that proponents would find attractive in this state. I also accept that it could potentially hold value for our state and for other stakeholders and the community. The Projects of Regional Significance pause which has been in place, as many of us have noted, since 2009, was in fact put in place to provide a similar such process. And what we've seen there play out, as has been noted, is that while it was due to be reviewed after 5 years, it didn't actually eventuate as a functional process in that it was never used. And as a result, it's generally regarded to be a failure, I'm led to believe, and I would agree with that assessment given its complete lack of use. Criteria for the legislated review of pause are mostly redundant, as we discussed in a briefing earlier today. Because the process was never used, most of the criteria that are in the legislation have never occurred in order to be reviewed. There is one criteria there in that legislated review that would remain relevant, however, and that's D, and that says any other matters relevant to the effect of this division on providing an efficient and effective planning approval process in Tasmania. That's quite a broad invitation to review not just the efficient and effective use of pause, but the efficient and effective planning approval process in Tasmania in the context of pause, the review that it's legislated to be reviewed as part of. I note, as the member for Hobart's comments indicated, that there was no public consultation process and no public report of a review of pause shared in the public domain, and no indication that, in fact, a review and analysis that perhaps could have been conducted in a limited way, but certainly a purposeful way in relation to that criteria D in the legislation. There's none in existence. It makes me wonder, Mr President, what would a formal review of pause, the principles it sought to give effect to, the efficient the efficient and effective planning approval process in Tasmania and what could be added to that, and the failure the failure of pause to result in the expected outcomes when it was first put forward. I wonder what such a review could have delivered to us. In considering developing new planning matters and processes, I think, and I'm making these reflections in the light of thinking about what a review might have provided to lead into the development of a new planning matter or process. I think that there are three basic sets of questions that government should be asking at the very earliest opportunity of beginning a process for a new, beginning the development process for a new process in the planning scheme, such as this. The first question that I think is really important is, what do proponents need? What are their priorities and concerns? The second set of questions would be, what do communities need? What are their priorities and concerns? And the third would be, what does good governance require when we consider this new planning matter or process? I believe that these questions should be asked at the outset of embarking on what will be the development of the new planning process, and would then form a foundation from which you would embark and engage in future work and development on top of what you had come to learn and understand from asking those questions. Engagement with all stakeholders, including the community, would be required in order to answer those three sets of questions. Answering these questions would provide the opportunity for consideration, analysis and appropriate balancing of the full range of needs, priorities and concerns. It would serve to ensure buy-in from all stakeholders and confidence in the process of development that would grow from it as it was taken forward. It would be the first and I think most important step in developing public confidence in and a social licence for the process under development that would become ultimately part of the planning scheme. When we had the chance to engage in this kind of thorough and inclusive process, in the contemplation of a review of pause and then the anticipation of a creation of a new process, what did we find that the government actually did? Mr President, the government certainly asked that first set of questions. What do proponents need? What are their priorities and concerns? In fact, I'm sure the answers to those questions were readily provided and very proactively being provided to government, absolutely appropriately. But my question is, when and how, at that earliest opportunity, did the government ask the equally important second question? What do communities need? What are their priorities and concerns? As it turns out, that question was never put to the Tasmanian community in respect to the development of this new process at that earliest opportunity. It was confirmed to us in briefings that there were no community stakeholders engaged by the government in the initial stage of contemplating the creation of this new process from the ashes of the failed pause process. Mr President, I would suggest that the neglect of community input and engagement at that point was wrong. It was a mistake. I think the community deserved better at that time. And sadly, I think the failure to give appropriate involvement to the community at that time set us up to be encountering some of the issues that are now being expressed here today and that we must deal with in the scrutiny and review of this bill. Additionally, Mr President, in the absence of that second question being asked and answered, in failing to include purposeful consideration of communities at that initial stage, we also curtailed, in some measure, effectively answering the third question of what does good governance require. Community input would have been fundamental to consider in answering that third question too. I think a great deal of consideration has been given to good governance in the process that has ensued since, and I think to good effect in many ways in what we see presented here today. But I think because we didn't include a lens of community that we would have gained in asking those questions at the earliest opportunity, we've got some missing gaps. And I think that's what those matters that we may be dealing with in the next stage of things are actually, we can find their origin in that. Community wasn't brought into this process until a draft bill was in place. And what effect does this have? Introducing community at that point, when there is already something presented to them. It tells the community members that they aren't central stakeholders in their own state's planning scheme. It sets up, I think, the opportunity for an adversarial approach. As I said, Mr. President, I think that the message that was sent to community at that time, that they aren't central to the earliest consideration in developing new matters in the planning scheme, is an unfortunate message, and I think it sets up an adversarial approach. In the development of this bill, the government failed in creating its own social licence for the new and significant process that it sought to create. What a shame, and how unnecessary. And as we make our way through consideration of this bill and potentially into the next stage, I hope that we can do work that helps to redress that to some extent. But I would acknowledge that it would have been more appropriate and perhaps easier if we hadn't had to do that, if it had been done correctly and inclusively in the first place. I think there's interesting parallels here, Mr. President, in the shortfalls of this process used to develop the major projects process itself, and in some of the shortfall that people have identified in the major projects process. I think what the government did in relation to not including community at the earliest opportunity, presenting community then at a slightly later stage with a completed entity to respond to in some sense. There was already a bill then as the first thing to respond to. And then not providing necessarily fair ways for that to be reviewed and assessed in a way that really, where communities felt included. There was a perception of not being included. I think that mimics some of the concerns that people actually have for the process presented in the bill, that community is not being included at the earliest opportunity, that in being presented with something that looks almost like a completed product, they are put into an adversarial role unnecessarily as their first involvement, and that there isn't necessarily a fair and transparent opportunity, or there's a perception that there's not, for the community members. I think that's an interesting parallel there. Mr. President, I would speak briefly about some of the concerns that have been expressed to us, I think broadly, many of us, by many community members about this bill and by other stakeholders. The context of this bill has been talked about by some other members. It's a crowded space at the moment. At the same time this bill has been in gestation, we've also had a new statewide planning scheme being created, still not entirely bedded down. We have a continuing ongoing review of the Tasmanian Planning Commission. And I note, as many others have, that progress has stalled on electoral donation reform, which, while not immediately pertinent to this bill, is tangentially pertinent, I think, and I think that's a matter we'll be discussing more in times to come.
The planning policies haven't been developed either.
The planning, indeed, that's a further part of this crowded area of many unresolved matters. And on top of that, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which presents many of its own problems, as others have noted. Another area of concern expressed is about what could be included, what could be drawn into this major projects process as presented in this bill. It's been put to me that this bill could see quite controversial proposals that have already been through, for instance, a council planning process and been rejected, or those that were approved by a council but have had that decision overturned through an appeal process, or those that are currently prohibited developments within a planning scheme. Could see those kinds of examples declared and assessed under this legislation. Many of us will have heard from a range of community stakeholders who are extremely alarmed on this point. They cite examples such as Cambria Green, the large-scale complex outside Swansea, arguing that such a project could be considered, and despite a rezoning application for the proponent's land having been rejected by the Tasmanian Planning Commission, and it could still be submitted under this bill to be assessed. Similarly, concerns for the integrity of our cityscapes and built heritage in Hobart and Launceston have been raised as concerns. Again and again, we've seen large developers putting forward quite vast, out-of-scale and inappropriate plans that will potentially dwarf our heritage-rich spaces and our cultural aesthetics. And we see what happens in local communities when those sorts of proposals are put forward under circumstances now. And I understand why people who feel alarmed at those prospects feel that there may be an easier pathway for some of those projects to be considered under this bill, and are concerned about that. Well, there is some additions that have been made, and potentially the community aren't as up to date with those additions, that do put some consideration that must be given to special arrangements in areas in local communities. Consideration can be given to those, and I think that's a really positive improvement that was made in the process of the bill. In fact, I was just about to mention that in my speech, but I can skip over that part. Mr President, the community's confidence has already been shaken with recent changes which many perceive to have undermined the integrity of Tasmania's planning system, including the new planning scheme's apparent, in some people's eyes, downgrading of protection of local character and values. And some have put to us that they've seen that demonstrated through projects such as Kangaroo Bay. I'm not making a comment on the merits or otherwise of that, but I did note, after hearing concerns raised from the public around it, we have also heard put to us by an industry stakeholder that that would be an example of a project that could be considered under this major projects process. While that was put to us, it's not confirmed to me that it could be, but if there's an industry stakeholder who believes that it could be, then that's an interesting thing to note in and of itself. Concerns based on lived experience in our communities makes communities extremely concerned that this proposed bill may bring eventualities that they find distressing in their local communities. Despite protestations from the government that this is not a fast-track legislation, the bill certainly appears to shift the emphasis for larger-scale projects towards approvals rather than assessment. And I think that there's potentially some adjustments, quite straightforward ones, that don't in fact interrupt the process of the bill, but would alleviate that perception. Because I think largely it probably is a perception. And I think if there's a way that we could alleviate the perception effectively without interrupting the intent and the process that's in the bill, we should consider this closely. And I hope that all members and the government will be open to considering that. No, I'm going to skip over that. We need to be very clear that a consequence of this bill, given community consternation and concern, could lead to the erosion of the building of a social licence for any of the projects that utilise the process. It's very much a shame and awkward if we've created a process that already has built-in opposition to what may come through and be subject to it. I think we may be able to, again, alleviate that outcome to some extent with some minor amendments that we may consider in the next stage that would really assist in helping calm community while, again, not interrupting the intent and the process that's there. Mr President, a further concern was around lack of merit appeals rights. Others have spoken about that in their contributions. It certainly sounds like it will be a matter that we discuss in detail in committee stage, should and when we come to it. It's been a matter of high concern for the community. I think I'm just going to mention very briefly that the principle of merit appeals rights is quite elemental in the idea of a functioning democracy. And I'll certainly speak more about that in detail when we do consider potential amendments that may be brought. A key concern that has been expressed in relation to this bill is around political influence. And I note and I take on face value also the comments and, in fact, the pride expressed in the fact that this bill, by departmental measures or by assertion from the department, has a very high level of transparency compared to other national examples, similar examples in planning schemes. That it has quite a high level of transparency and arm's length operation from political decision makers, and I applaud that. And I think in many measures of it, it does. I think that's accurate, and I think that pride in that is quite well placed. It's certainly part of the government's narrative around this bill that they make a claim that it takes the politics out of planning. And as I said, in some ways I believe that's true. But I do also believe that in making that claim, the government is downplaying the role that the minister still plays in the process. And I think that that's still a matter for us to contemplate further in terms of its necessity. Characterising the power to declare a project at the outset and therefore bring it into this process as, and I quote, simply provides for the proponent to enter the process and somehow imply that that's a simple matter, that it's very straightforward and it's not of political consequence, I think is misleading. I think that power to declare a project has to be recognised for what it is, and that is it's significant and it sits in a political player in the process. The opportunity for the minister to specify particular experience or qualifications in one member of the panel also has the potential to be significant. I fully appreciate that this is not the minister appointing a member of the panel, and of course we would all, I think, be quite appalled if there was that power there. But even this power to specify a particular experience or qualification in a member of the panel has the potential to be significant. It can be quite narrow. It could point towards either a small handful or perhaps even one person in a state like Tasmania. So while the minister isn't appointing that person directly, in defining that the qualifications and experience in a particular way, the minister could quite certainly point towards very particular people. And again, I think the perception of that is perhaps more problematic than, in reality, the risk it presents. And so what I would suggest is that a case has not been made as to why it's necessary or valuable for us as a state and for good governance that the minister should have that power, and why, over and above the fact that the TPC could make this determination itself independently from any political influence at all, why this should be an essential power for the minister to hold in this process. If the case hasn't been made that it's necessary, and we know that the independent entity involved, the TPC, could quite well undertake that determination of particular qualifications and experience required, why would we have something there that has that perception, if not tangible, risk of political influence? We'll likely discuss this in more detail in relation to an amendment, Mr. President. A further concern that I'm going to touch on is around so-called safeguards that are in the bill. We've heard from the government they believe there are sufficient safeguards in the bill to protect the public interest. However, Mr. President, I've already raised that we already have a serious anomaly right back at the beginning surrounding the failure to undertake a genuine 5-year review of PAWS. Granted, it couldn't have been the full review that was specified in the legislation because of the inapplicability of a number of the criteria, but at least one broad and significant criteria could have been the basis of that review. when that process was introduced into the state planning system, in 2009, the statutory 5-year review was inserted at that time as a safeguard that in the end has proven ineffectual from the Tasmanian community's standpoint because it didn't result in delivering the review that it mandated. Mr. President, I believe that's a breakdown of good governance. It's a breakdown of a safeguard. And it's oversights like these, inadvertent or deliberate, which contribute to heightened community concern and distrust and the erosion of public confidence. It also means that people are understandably suspicious when they are told blithely that there are sufficient safeguards to prevent politicisation of the planning system or to prevent fast-tracking of projects proposed by corporate donors or supporters of whoever is the government of the day. People understandably would hold suspicions, may feel distrustful of promised safeguards if we have a history of those safeguards not delivering from the community's perspective. I'm going to mention the complexity of this bill as a matter of concern, not because it shouldn't be complex in delivering what it's going to deliver ultimately to us as a state, but in terms of the fact that we are going to be dealing with it in a complex way here because of the quantum and nature of concerns and issues that remain to be resolved and discussed at this stage of the process. Because I believe of a failure to effectively address those things by an inclusive and appropriate process earlier on. I understand other members have circulated proposed amendments and I have circulated a suite of amendments for consideration during the committee stage, should we get there. I intend to address all those amendments in detail when we are there in due course, rather than to speak on detail to any more of them here. In particular, I'm interested in hearing other members' views and ideas via amendments on how to protect the community's rights and the capacity to participate in the process of this major project's endeavour, including potentially merit-based appeals rights, providing clarity over the permit criteria and ensuring public confidence in the non-politicisation and transparency of the process. I also need to foreshadow that I intend... let me move on from that. I'd particularly like to mention my gratitude to OPC for their assistance in drafting the suite of amendments that I intend to bring. The responsiveness and alacrity with which they've been drafted in the past 36 hours or so have been really appreciated, and I'm very grateful for their professionalism and the quality of the work. To conclude, Mr President, 2 threshold tests against which it's important to assess this bill, I would say, are: firstly, how does the proposed bill measure against the fundamental democratic touchstone principles of good governance, transparency and accountability, fairness and due process? And 2, do the proposed changes in this bill invest in strengthening social licence for any project that goes through the proposed new process? I think those 2 questions still have elements that need to be answered, and I would hope that we can potentially provide some answers to that as we further discussions here. I would contend that this bill falls short on both those counts to some extent, and in doing so, instead of being a valuable and well-respected addition undoubtedly in the community's mind to our planning scheme, it risks contributing to community anxiety and division and undermining the social licence for projects coming forward. I suggest the last thing the planning environment in this state needs is greater inflammation of community fear and anger at being taken for granted and having the interests of developers put ahead of the interests of the community. These systemic failures, to some extent, at earlier stages of this process, in good governance, in transparency and fairness, in inclusion, would potentially be enshrined in this bill as it currently stands, And I think that would ensure that proponents accessing the process would be at risk of failing to secure a social licence for their project. I'm not comfortable that we seem to be... No, I'm going to not mention that, Mr. President. I think that we can engage in effective and helpful work in this chamber in the passage of this bill. I think that some of the consternation and concerns that have failed to be allayed in the community across an extensive period of time that this has been developed can be to some extent ameliorated in some straightforward ways through some straightforward amendments that will not impact on the intent and the veracity of the process as it's been conceptualised by the government. I think, though, that they will be important in terms of public perception and in terms of rebuilding a sense of social licence and community and public confidence in this bill as it passes through our chamber and becomes something that is given effect to in our community. I look forward to us delivering on that for the Tasmanian community and helping to provide that more positive outcome than may otherwise have been achieved. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be now read the second time. The honourable member for Mersey.